Shortly after the last body was recovered, Ranger Jansen was released from the fire and sent home for a brief rest. Many years later, in her unpublished autobiography, Have You Ever Stopped to Wonder?, Lois Jansen would describe this, the third day of the fire. Bob came home Sunday afternoon for a 24-hour rest. So tired and unstrung, he hardly seemed like the husband and father we knew. I knew the children were frightened, and I couldn't do much for them because I was frightened too. His feet were in terrible shape, swollen so that it was very hard to get his boots off, and his socks, glued on by running blisters, had to be soaked off in the bathtub. After the second tub of water, the first was absolutely black, he called me back in and asked me to burn his shirt and undershirt. I started to protest, thinking that I could wash them, and he nearly shouted, "Burn them, they smell of death." Then he asked me to wash his hair, which smelled the same, as he was too weak to do it by himself as he sat in the tub. I soaped and lathered his head, but he could still smell the odor. I thought this was his imagination until I got a whiff of the leather watch band he had worn when he sat with his arms around Joe Sylvia trying to keep him warm. It had a terrific odor, so we burned that too. What shall I tell you of that strange night? Ruth, Paul, and Roger, the Jansens' 3 young children, were so upset they couldn't settle down, and to my sorrow I finally had to spank them to make them stay in bed. They cried themselves to sleep. Bob seemed to need help to get into his pajamas and into bed, and then he said to me, "I don't want you to sleep with me," and he turned his face to the wall. Hurt and anxious, I lay down on a davenport in the living room, but during the night he called so many times for water, which he drank in great gulping swallows as though he couldn't get enough of it, that I made up a pallet and slept on the floor beside him. Even Lassie, the Jansens' collie dog, with that family telepathy she always showed, went moaning around and around outside the house. Fearing she would awaken Bob, I let her in, and she settled down to sleep at my feet. Then Bob began to moan and finally scream and call in agony, "Go away! Go away!" These sleeping nightmares, as Lois referred to them, would plague Bob's and the entire family's nights for years to come. Even though the Mann Gulch fire was not yet controlled, Jansen was relieved of fire duty on Monday so that he could return to work. At the time, the offices and buildings of the Canyon Ferry Ranger District were being physically moved to a new site on Helena's east side, and Bob was busy overseeing the move. But the smoke from the fire had hardly cleared when his moving duties kept being interrupted by requests from family members of the lost men to be taken into Mann Gulch and shown where their sons, their brothers, or their nephews had fallen. Because Bob felt the families deserved this courtesy, and that he was the one who had discovered and helped recover the remains, he never turned down a single request. But he dreaded these appeals from the family because with each return to the gulch, he'd be asked the inevitable, detailed questions about the positions of the bodies when they were discovered, and whether he thought their lost ones had suffered much before they died. With each of these treks into Mann Gulch, Bob would relive those early morning hours of the fire when he searched back and forth across the hillside, amidst the fire and choking smoke, to find yet another charred corpse of a once young firefighter. And after each of these visits, Jansen's sleeping nightmares would return to terrify his nights and those of his wife and children. 6 weeks after the fire in late September, the Forest Service convened a border review to look into the causes of the disaster. They flew to Helena and toured the fire scene with survivors Dodge, Sally, and Rumsey, and Jansen, his supervisor Moyer, and several other men involved in the incident. The board returned to Missoula, reviewed the written statements provided by the men, and then summoned them to Missoula to testify. In a controversial move, the Board of Review closed the proceedings to the general public and excluded the media. Ranger Jansen attended the review, and provided his testimony, but only on the condition that he not be forced to face his interrogators. Bob gave his testimony sitting on a wooden chair with his back to the board. He answered every question they put to him. Within days of wrapping up the review, the board released their findings. Despite Jansen's earlier misgivings, no one on the board found fault with his handling of the fire or the rescue mission, and no one, including Jansen, Wag Dodge, or Earl Cooley, was blamed for the tragedy. When Bob read the Board of Review's report, it seemed to him that even the 13 dead smoke jumpers were exonerated. The regional forester at the time, Pete Hansen, maybe summed up the board's thinking best when he wrote, "There occur times when men's lives are at stake, when they alone must make a decision as to the course of action they select." Needless to say, the board's findings were not popular with the families of the victims or the media, which had been barred from the proceedings. The Board of Review did, however, issue a list of recommendations based upon their investigations. Among other things, they suggested that future smoke jumper and firefighter training place more emphasis on crew discipline and also fire behavior. But even after the fire had long been extinguished, the last of the funerals attended, and the Board of Review had issued its findings, the tragedy of the Mann Gulch fire continued for Bob Jansen and indirectly his family. The fire claimed its 14th victim in November of 1949. Winter had yet to lay its heavy hand across the forest and meadows of the Canyon Ferry Ranger District when in early November, Jansen received a series of telephone calls from pioneer fire researcher Harry T. Gisborne in Missoula. Gisborne was an old acquaintance of Jansen's, working for the Forest Service's regional headquarters. Gisborne was fascinated by what he'd heard about the fire's blow-up and wanted Bob to guide him into Mann Gulch so he could see firsthand if there was any evidence to support his theories about what might have caused the fire to behave as it did and ultimately trap the 13 smoke jumpers. However, Jansen was well aware of Gisborne's history of heart problems, and he was reluctant to be involved in any plan that involved walking Gisborne into such rugged, steep terrain. But Harry was insistent, and even though Bob sent him maps and photographs and various reports of the fire, Gisborne persisted in his request to be taken into Mann Gulch. So on November 9th, he and Jansen ended up walking into the gulch. Keenly aware of Harry's heart condition, Jansen would hike with Harry for short distances, then set him down on a pretense of discussing some facet of the fire. And then they'd get up and hike some more. They continued in this fashion most of the day. Gisborne was in his element. But finally, late in the afternoon, Jansen pointed out that it was getting late and time to start back to their parked vehicle. Harry resisted leaving at first, but finally let Bob guide him out of the gulch. They were just short of the parked vehicle and picking their way across a steep talus slope running down to the Missouri River when Harry suggested they sit down and take another short break. They had just sat down on the edge of a game trail they were following when Gisborne suddenly stood up and then just as quickly collapsed with what would be a fatal heart attack. There was little Jansen could do for Gisborne except loosen Harry's necktie and then wedge some rocks beneath Harry's body to keep it from rolling down the slope into the water below. But not certain Gisborne was dead or alive, Jansen dashed back to the vehicle and started for help. He hadn't driven far when he encountered a ranch hand from a local ranch. Bob quickly advised the man of his situation and asked him if he would go for help, telling the man that he would go back and wait with Gisborne. But as sometimes happens in emergency situations, the ranch hand became confused and sent the sheriff and his rescue party to the wrong drainage. Ranger Jansen, upon returning to Harry's body, determined Gisborne was in fact dead. He covered Harry's corpse with his own jacket, and Bob sat beside the body, waiting for the rescue party in a cold, drizzling rain until well after dark and the arrival of the sheriff and his men. The night screaming that troubled Bob and the Jansen family returned that evening. And the fire continued to haunt Jansen. Through the early spring of 1950, he was asked to guide more relatives of the dead smoke jumpers up to the scene of the disaster and show them the recently installed white concrete crosses erected by the Missoula smoke jumpers. With each visit, he'd trudge up the canyon with a father or brother or someone close to the victim, and he'd again answer the inevitable heart-rending questions. Then later, in the middle of the night, he'd scream Lois and the kids awake. But finally, in late May of 1950, with his doctor's recommendation, the Forest Service transferred Jansen and his family to the Priest Lake Ranger Station in northern Idaho. In an effort to try to put the whole business of the fire and Gisborne's deaths behind him, his last act before leaving Helena was to burn the hat he'd worn during the Mann Gulch fire and burn the jacket he'd been wearing the evening Harry Gisborne died in Rescue Gulch. The aftermath. If Bob Jansen were alive today, he would probably insist that of all the men who emerged from the Mann Gulch fire, he always felt he was the more fortunate. Over time, whatever guilt he felt for having 14 men die on his ranger district on his watch became easier to live with. Eventually, the night screaming became less and less frequent, and he and the family learned to sleep through the night again. But fate was not through with Bob Jansen yet. While serving at Priest Lake, Bob started to develop symptoms associated with a hereditary kidney disease he carried. Doctor's appointments and tests and hospital visits became the norm. In 1955, the Forest Service transferred Bob to an assignment in Newport, Washington, so he and the family could be closer to medical care. Then in 1960, he was transferred back to Idaho to Coeur d'Alene. Here he would continue to work for the Forest Service until his death from heart failure in 1965. Death would also dog some of the other men of Mann Gulch. Wag Dodge dropped out of the smoke jumper program the year following the fire, but continued to work for the Forest Service. Just 5 short years after the fire, Wag Dodge would die of Hodgkin's disease at the age of 38. Walt Rumsey, after surviving the fire in 1949, met a violent death in a small plane crash in 1980. The C-47 co-pilot, Frank Small, continued to fly, but in 1956, while flying back to Grangeville, Idaho after dropping some smoke jumpers on a fire, he suffered a heart attack while at the controls. Small still managed to land the plane safely, although he collapsed and died on the runway as he stepped from the plane. Other men put Mann Gulch behind them. Spotter Earl Cooley, like Bob Jansen, went on to pursue a successful Forest Service career. Cooley, who passed away in 2009, retired from the Forest Service and lived his last days in Missoula. Bob Sallee jumped the remainder of the 1949 season and came back the following year, but it would be his last. Sallee went on to pursue an engineering career, marry, and raise a family. Like many of the men, Sallee rarely talked about the Mann Gulch fire during his lifetime. The fact is, he never told his wife and children about his role in the fire. They only learned of his involvement when Norman McLean's book, Young Men in Fire, was published in 1992. The last survivor of the Mann Gulch fire, Bob Sallee, passed away in Spokane, Washington in May of 2014. For all the tragedy associated with the Mann Gulch fire and the events that followed the fire, there were also some positive things that emerged from its ashes. Beginning with the 1950 fire season and continuing to this day, extra radios and local topographic maps are sent out with smoke jumper and firefighter crews. After 1949, smoke jumper and firefighter training began to place heavy emphasis on crew and foreman working relationships, especially crew discipline. The 10 standard firefighting orders developed in the 1950s, the Forest Service Equipment and Development Centers, and the Fire Science Laboratories all owed their origins in part to the disaster in Mann Gulch. And finally, there's the fire's continuing legacy as that of a learning tool for wildland firefighters like yourselves. Each year, the Mann Gulch Fire National Historic Site serves as an outdoor classroom for both new and experienced firefighters. Every year, men and women climb the North Slope and try to learn the lessons in leadership, communication, suppression strategy, and firefighting history that Mann Gulch offers. Epilogue. In May of 1950, before he left the Canyon Ferry Ranger District, Bob Jansen climbed to the ridge line between Meriwether and Mann Gulch, and at a spot where one could look north into Mann Gulch, erected a routed wooden sign bearing this simple message: Mann Gulch. This area burned August 5th, 1949. 13 men lost their lives on the hillside opposite this point. That wooden sign placed on that limestone ridge so many years ago by Ranger Jansen has long since disappeared. But the memory of the fire, the men who died and the men who survived it, lives on. The Mann Gulch Fire, and like most wildfires in the West, most of which are eventually extinguished or burn themselves out and are forgotten, became seared into the memory of the Forest Service and anyone who has ever fought a wildland fire. The 13th fire is a powerful and continuing legacy of the young men who parachuted into Mann Gulch, but it is also the legacy of the other men whose lives it touched and drastically affected. May all these men and the sacrifices they made always be remembered. Thank you.